Patriots, all people who love them country bad, love them homeland, will never give it up to another nation. This a fi we, we da fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This a fi we, we da fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This a me, my name is Pupa. Belize me come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago agreement by the slave master. Talking about the hip and the Belize and dollar because this a fi we da fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. No, this a fi we da fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. I know we should always help when neighbor, especially in time.
And good morning, and welcome to the fifth edition of Sunday Review for this morning, February 12th, 2023, which is also the 23rd anniversary of the founding of our Library of African and Indigenous Studies, which is the headquarters of the community-based organization United Black Association for Development Educational Foundation. I'm the chairperson. We're going into our 27th year next month. This is where we make sense of the news, Belize's only news review talk show. Daily, I'm not daily, on Monday mornings, weekly, most Sunday morning. We never had last Sunday because, I had to go and bash up with Dara and the rest of our community. Dara Joel Robinson is food activist for youths in particular, and we had a really good time last week, Saturday and Sunday night at Berzal, and I miss out if I never come. So yes, I produce and host Sunday Review. Our guest this morning, absolutely no stranger to us, no stranger, a family for sure. Sister, African-centered sister, by way of Caribbean parents, active in London in a number of formations, definitely a sister of Pan-African mindsets. Our sister Esther Stanford Jose. Esther is also a scholar activist, a reparationist, a Jewish counsel. Morning, sis.
Morning, Sister Yaya.
It's good to see you as always. How are you being?
Yes, I'm well. I'm very well, thank you, and I hope you are too.
I kind of pissed off actually because I've been informed that we're not live streaming because of a technical issue again, but the show will be posted on Facebook after the show has
I, I,
ended.
I hope these technical issues are not just when I come on this show.
That the vibrations are strong from the creator we ancestors. I guess it just collide with the I don't know. I'm hoping that's not the case either too, Sister Esther. Valid point. But I keep it real. When I pissed off, I pissed off. I have to try to stay focused right now. And so this conversation this morning, Sister Esther, and a number of formations out of London in particular, that Sister Esther has co-founded and is the spokesperson for, as it relates specifically to African reparations. UEF has been in solidarity with them for a number of years now. So usually the first Sunday of every month, UEF from the bottom up is leading African reparations awareness because the state, as usual, has failed to do so. We still hold them accountable to do so and to be knowledgeable because they're not, clearly from the things they said about African descendants racialized as Black people in Belize in particular, and as it relates to African reparations. And so last month, we were supposed to focus specifically on ecocide. We never do that. So we say, okay, this month, we are focused specifically on ecocide. It has thus expanded. Sister Esther, let me name two of the formations that you lead. It's the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, founded in 2001, known as PARCO, and the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, known as INOSAR. Now, the parent of the campaign, we stop the Maangamisi, we charge genocide, we charge ecocide. The parent of that campaign is PARCO. As Sister Esther shares more with us about PARCO, INOSAR, Stop the Maangamisi, We Charge Genocide, We Charge Ecocide campaign, I'll make an effort to screen share to enhance what Sister Esther will say. Jada, let me know if you can read these documents online. Go ahead, Sister Esther.
Hi, greetings, greetings. So yes, I've been on before, so I have done some explaining, but just to say briefly, I think in terms of our discussion today, focusing on ecocide, um, well, actually, all three structures you mentioned, in truth, are important. But I'll begin with PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, and we are a reparation social movement network in the international social movement for African reparations. And our work is really about amplifying the voices of reparatory justice interest and African heritage communities of resistance in Europe. So, amplifying the voices, the perspectives, the strategies, the tactics of our global movement in Europe. And we also provide advocacy support. We provide helping to build the capacity of social movement organizations so that we can actually enforce our will, and that we also connect globally into a framework where we can lend support to one another. And in that sense, we get a sense that we truly do have an international social movement for African reparations. It's not quite yet global, but it's on the way to becoming so. And this is the movement from the ground up that is grassroots led, that represents the interests of communities who are in resistance to neocolonialism, to colonialism, to coloniality, to imperialism, to dispossession, etc., etc. And that's important to mention because within our communities, we have what's known as communities of resistance, we have communities of surrender, and we have communities of paralysis. So, communities of surrender are those who are not really articulating or organized for themselves as a group in terms of our group rights, our group identity, substantive African representation. We just exist as populations, but we often are subjugated and allow ourselves to be eclipsed by perhaps a more powerful nation, perhaps one that has dominated us, colonized us, and we have not yet sort of sought to recover our interests, our own interests in terms of a sovereignty mindset. And then you have the communities of paralysis who are kind of stuck in the middle between those communities who are in resistance and those who are in surrender. And they're in a state of paralysis because they're not yet quite sure. They know that the current status quo is not really serving their interests, but they have a degree of fear and complexes as a result of internalized oppression and historic injustice that makes them perhaps doubt our own people's capacity to be the change. And so they're in a state of paralysis because even though they know better, and they know that they're dissatisfied, they don't yet have the ability or the courage, or perhaps are fearful of the consequences of actually what it means to step out and really truly defend one's interests. So, as PARCO, we are particularly interested in supporting and amplifying the voices of those in resistance, in reparatory justice resistance today, who are often marginalized, silenced, subjugated in favor of elites from their respective regions and territories and countries where they live, and others who, elites who sort of seek to usurp their voice, usurp their agency, usurp their own people's rights to self determination, etc., etc. So that's Parco.
Sister Esther, it's the first time that I can recall I've heard these categories of communities. Now, what and I know some of our people push back on UE, not UE, and me having scholars, and I would say to my scholars or academians, let's make an effort to simplify the language so the people may understand. But I definitely value the empirical or the research that's done because oftentimes we're living these experiences, we're not analyzing it, we're not researching how what we're experiencing is similar to other African descendants racialized as Black people globally. So this is new to me, and I like these three classifications: communities of resistance,
Surrender,
communities of surrender, communities of paralysis,
paralysis,
and
and
communities of
communities. Yeah.
resistance. Where did this language come from? How did this
So
come to be?
the term communities of resistance has been in operation a long time. In truth, I mean, one of the well-known advocates who've used this term is Bell Hooks. Okay. She has analyzed and theorized about communities of resistance from her own lived experience, and seeing this, and obviously recognizing uh, women of African heritage of being part of a community of resistance in terms of our own interests collectively, but also by extension, our people. And then there are many others who have used this terminology. I know from our own PARCO work, the analysis around communities of surrender and communities of paralysis has been very much championed by PARCO's very own co-vice chair with myself, that is Kofi Mawuli-Klune. And I think the key point to mention here is that when you talk about scholarship, this is not necessarily a document or a paper that has been written where we have put this down as an academic text, but this is the everyday theorization and intellectual production that happens when you are in struggle. And there is a perception that to be an intellectual means that you have to be an academic with letters after your name, attached to a university, earning, particular money as an elite person, academic elite in one's country or region or what have you. But in movements, by virtue of the fact that we are existing oftentimes on the margins, again, another analysis that comes from Bell Hooks, we have deeper insights. We theorize about our condition because we know that the dominant perspectives do not speak to our realities. And therefore, we have to create terms, we have to create language, we have to actually create ideas that can not only resist and rebel and revolt against the status quo, but also can prefigure new worlds and new realities. And that means to bring it into being, even though it might not yet be here. But we have a vision that we know that life can be different. So as social movements, and reparations is also a social movement with at its heart the remnants of the Pan-African liberation movement. But it's a social movement. And what that means is that social movements do not just produce, as R.D.G. Kelly, who is a famous African-American historian that studies popular protest and social movements and the struggles of the what some might call the working classes, the grassroots, the zinc fence, as I've heard you refer to, Sister Yaya. But really, so he argues that social movements do not just produce statistics of oppression and what has happened to us, but all movements do something which is really quite poetic, which is to transport us to another place, to actually help us envision and what's called convoke, something that he has written about extensively called the Black Radical Imagination, which is that vision that we can see of a future that is different to the present reality of sufferation and downpression that many of us experience, and that hope that propels all of our activism, all of our organizing, all of our sacrifices, because we know that we have a responsibility to create a new world. And it's something that we can draw inspiration from many. Karl Marx once said that philosophers theorize about the world, but the whole point is to be able to change the world. He said something like that. So it all leads to the same place. There have been many people, not just from people racialized as so-called Black or of African heritage or African Caribbean heritage, but many people who've been involved in struggle to transform themselves, their communities, their societies, and by extension, the world, who have been involved in articulating this struggle and knowledge production, or what's called co-production, so that it's not just seen as the academics who are, I don't know, political scientists or historians who have the final say about what a people's struggle is. Actually, we, the people, make our own history, and therefore, part of that history making is narrating what we have done, why we have done it, and how we are doing it, and to what ends we are doing it.
Excellent point, Sister Esther. So to bring it home, and that's why I like reasoning with people who know differently than I do. That on this past Thursday, February 9th, was the 54th anniversary of the formation of UEF's parent organization, United Black Association for Development, UBAD. Now, that organization started out under colonial rule because we didn't have political independence, whatever that it may be, even if it's flag independence, we didn't have that. But at that time, a group of African descendants racialized as Black people saw the need to create a space to center themselves, tell their own stories and the stories of African descendants racialized as Black globally. 54 years ago, I get bumps all over my body. There is no way, and some of them are our ancestors, some of them are elders, and supported primarily by Belizean people at home and abroad. There is no way 54 years ago that group, that small group of people could have envisioned 54 years later that the Mandela newspaper would be the leading newspaper in the country. 54 years it'll be this year, that there will be a radio station that will celebrate 34 years this year, that there'll be a social consciousness arm, UEF, that will celebrate 27 years this year, that there'll be a television which will celebrate 19 years this year, 2023. There's no way you could have visualized that. And that because Zinc Fence exists primarily on the support of the people of Belize, that we can have this kind of engagement with our African descendants, racialized as Black people globally, to tell our own stories, to center ourselves. And so this is, Zinc Fence is a community of resistance. And so I say to African descendants, racialized as Black people, stop talking badly about ourselves, that every other group is organized and every other group have made progress. We have. We don't know our stories. We don't know our ancestors' stories. When you look at Belize tongue in particular, that is a community of resistance because that's where the majority of our African enslaved foreparents were. When our African, primarily males, were forced to provide free labor for enslavers in the Belize River Valley, for example, our sisters or grandmothers or elders, or they were in Belize tongue, actively in resistance. And so that is why UEF's position, and with a lot of guidance from our sisters and brothers working with Sister Esther, that we were very clear when we sent letters to the cabinet, to the Prime Minister of Belize in October and November of 2021 to say, you do not have the legal, moral, ethical right to advocate, to speak, to negotiate on behalf of African descendants racialized as Black people. We are the ones who still carry the physical scar, who suffer oppression as the children of those African descendants. I have the mic for a while, Sister Esther. I want you to center, Sister Esther, that particular mindset that African descendants racialized as Black people, many of us are living in communities of paralysis and don't recognize it, have lost hope, have political leaders like our area reps in Belize who are not substantive representatives. They don't represent the interests of us at heart. Can you share, Sister Esther, that is not an isolated incident? That's not an isolated experience, that's a global experience, and why we need to move from communities of paralysis to communities of resistance?
Yes, I mean, it's a global phenomenon in truth, especially where we as a people have been dispossessed of our homelands, of our lineages, our identities, our governance systems, even though we have tried to recreate some of these in the diaspora. The mere fact that we are living in neo-colonial nation states means that we've not really fully experienced decolonization, and we've not recovered or had restituted our own African forms of governance wherever we are. and decision making that is based on communitarianism, that is about participatory decision making, and so this notion of the descriptive representation that you've highlighted, where you will often have people that might look like us, might be born in the same area, district, town, region, what have you, but who are using or exercising or deploying a form of state power, for instance, or corporate power, or economic power that is deployed over our people. Yeah, they might be the ones who quote unquote are in charge, but the system is still largely Eurocentric because it was designed by Europeans to empower them and not to empower us. That is the only way an enslaving and colonizing force can keep a people who are more powerful than them, more numerous than them, in a state of constant subordination and submission, which is what happened during chattel enslavement and during colonialism, and is still happening, although we're in the modern era of neo-colonialism. That is still very much the fact, because the world order, the map that is there today, the country borders were not set by us largely. And so what you have across the world is a resurgence of indigenous people, of the so-called Americas, Abya Yala, of Africa, of Oceania, Pacific, Asia, etc., who are seeking to rediscover aspects of who they were and renew the best aspects of who they were in order to guide them into a better future. So that is really what's going on. And it's those forces who are dissatisfied with the status quo that, in truth, are the real ones who propel social changes, political changes, environmental changes, cultural changes, ecological changes in any given society. It's always the ones who resist the fact that inequality is just something that we're born with and that we have to live with, and that there's nothing we can do about it. That actually we can have a world that is fairer for all people and fairer for those people who have been racialized as black or as other, from any other people that is not racialized as white.
Thanks, Sister Esther. Before we go to our first break, I wanted to note that recently, I need to look for the time frame, but as recent as this week, that the government of Belize, I believe it was Thursday or Friday, in the Senate, expressed that they, after maybe about a week or so ago, had expressed that they would ratify this CASO agreement, which is a Latin America and Caribbean treaty, as it relates to people, for example, in Belizeans, having access to information as it relates to environmental matters, that there's active people participation in such policies and laws, and that there is access to justice when there has been environmental harm as it relates to the environment and people, that the Senate has decided they will pause on the ratification, because this CASO agreement is named after a region in Costa Rica, and Costa Rica signed the agreement but did not ratify it. And now the state is saying they'll wait to see what Costa Rica will do before they forward the CASO agreement. So here again, you have a small group of people, political elites, the Caribbean. This administration has majority in the House, and so they're deciding without any referendum, without any active people campaign to raise people awareness about this CASO agreement. UEF has been active doing that. If you go to Facebook, it's hashtag BZEESCAZUEAGREEMENTUEF, because we're consistent about it's up to the people to do the work in our interest, even though it's the state that has the primary responsibility to do so. And so UEF did not know about this CASO agreement I did not know about it until I was doing research about, I found out about Sister Esther from doing research about African reparations on YouTube, and the ancestors led me to her, and I'm thankful. So the Stop the Mangamisi We Charge Ecocide, We Charge Genocide is a child of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, PARCO. And December 2nd, 2018, PARCO sent a position statement on universities and reparative justice programs to CARICOM. If I'm wrong, let me know, Sister Esther. On page 25, it was a long article. This is what was said, and this is how UEF, United Black Association for Development Educational Foundation, became aware of this CASO agreement. And so I'm showing Belizean people the connection between African reparations and ecocide, and Sister Esther will share some more in the second segment. But as it relates to today's CASO agreement, this is what that paragraph said from PARCO. We're very encouraged, however, by the good practice around public participation and partnership working that has been necessary in the development of the historic regional agreement on access to information, public participation, and justice in environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, adopted at Escazú, Costa Rica on 4th March 2018. The Escazú agreement, which was built on negotiated with the direct and significant participation of representatives of civil society organizations from various countries of the region, seeks to ensure that all people have access to timely and reliable information, can participate effectively in the decisions that affect their lives and the environment, and access justice in environmental matters. It places citizen action and environment defenders at the center, recognize the rights of those who have traditionally been underrepresented, excluded, or marginalized, thus contributing to the fulfillment of the 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals. Last two paragraphs. So far, the agreement has been signed but not yet ratified by Antigua and Barbuda, Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Guyana, Mexico, Panama, Peru, St. Lucia, Uruguay, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. Last sentence. In our view, the approaches being taken to information rights of the citizens in the region are very much absent, but very much needed in the region's approaches to reparatory justice. You have a minute to close out. If you just want to minimize that, Sister Esther, to make that.
Yeah, I mean, that the context of that is that the paper was really critiquing CARICOM leaders' interventions in reparatory justice by, again, going over the heads of ordinary people, negotiating some deal with the University of Glasgow. And we were speaking out on this in terms of this practice that denies that reparations are a right of so-called victims, that is, affected communities. And in the paper, we were highlighting an example of good practice in the region in relation to the Escazú agreement that we felt should be similarly adopted in terms of the spirit of the Escazú agreement should be adopted in relation to how CARICOM nation states and their leaders in the various national reparations committees and commissions, etc., should be working around reparations, which is recognizing that ordinary people have a right to information, have a right to be included in decision making, have a right to actually define and describe and think about what they want to see in the region, as opposed to having a 10-point plan imposed upon them by the state, where they've not been involved in developing it, and their visions are not in that plan.
You're good, sis, you're good. We're going to our first break. Thanks a million, Sister Esther. Stay tuned, we'll be right back.
Lately, many things have changed. We changed, of course, but we're still the same. During this pandemic, information is our main partner. The most widely known antimicrobials are called antibiotics, but they are useless to fight diseases such as COVID-19 because it is caused by a virus, whereas antibiotics cure diseases of bacterial origin. Therefore, if you feel sick, do not self-medicate. Consult a health professional qualified to write a prescription and take antibiotics only when prescribed. Lately,
Smart continues to expand its internet coverage countrywide to help you live a smarter life.
Our villagers are very happy. They are pleased to know that Smart went the extra mile to put a tower in our village so that our villagers can get live stream on their TVs and they can get their kids doing their online classes. I want to say to Smart, thank you for making it possible for us to get internet in Gardenia Village. We really do appreciate it.
Smart continues to take the internet and mobile services to communities across Belize. Now save even more when you bundle your Smart broadband with Smart mobile services. Smart, bringing people together.
We all need a vacation, a break, an escape, a getaway from the ordinary. Have fun and try new things. Create lasting memories. Make your vacation one to remember. Come in today and apply for an easy credit vacation loan at any of our Atlantic Bank branches. We have great interest rates, convenient repayment terms, and loan packages for all your traveling adventures. Let us work hard for you, because life should be easy.
Atlantic Bank, building the future together.
Country bad, love them homeland. We'll never give it up to another nation. This time we we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Follow me now. This time we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This time my name is Pupa. Believe me, come from the village. We the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Come on. This time we the fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. I know we should always help our neighbor, especially in times of natural disaster. But this is not the case with Guatemala, because the poor people will never see a dollar.
Segment of Sunday Review, where we make sense of the news. This is the only news review talk show. I look at news stories at home and abroad, and then I bring people in who are credible, relatable, who know differently, so that we become more knowledgeable. Respect to Jada Anderson, our youth master control operator in Krem Television. We're now live on Facebook. Thank you, Creator and Ancestors. I have to know. Thanks so much, Jada. Sincerely, Jada Anderson, and all those who made sure that we were back live again. And Sister Esther, in this segment, we'll focus on what ecocide is, because I know one of the campaigns, Stop the Maangamisi, we charge ecocide, we charge genocide. I want us to look at what is ecocide, what is reparatory justice, and why is it that you don't hear the description of ecocide? You hear climate justice, climate change. You all are the first people I hear use the terminology of ecocide. Why is that?
That's a really interesting point that you mention. And maybe it's because there isn't enough amplification of the voices of those in social movements who are struggling to transform the world. And the terminology of ecocide is being used by people who would see themselves as environmentalists, so that part of different environmental movements and struggles and campaigns, but also African reparationists and indigenous people of all descriptions have been utilizing the terminology of ecocide, because there is a direct connection between genocide and ecocide. And so in the Stop the Maangamisi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, which was formed in 2015, that came out of a lot of PARCO's networking, in particular working with communities of resistance all across the world, we felt it was important to popularize the term ecocide, because it wasn't, we felt, and it's true, it wasn't being given enough primacy in our own struggles for repair, because the harm was just seen as being about what had happened to us as African people, wherever we were, say in the Caribbean, in the wider Abya Yala or the wider Americas, on the continent of Africa, etc., etc. But there wasn't a recognition that part of our enslavement and colonization and dispossession was also about trying to kill the earth, the environment, because that's what happened. Depopulation itself, there's some studies that have been done by some scholars at the University of London that argued the genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas resulted in a cooling of planet Earth. That was ecocide. The introduction of plantation industrial complex harmed the earth. Monocropping harmed the earth. Now, bearing in mind that our colonizers saw earth as separate, the elites, let me just be very clear, the elites, not all of them, because even within societies racialized as white, those who traditionally were more in touch with Mother Earth, Mother Nature, were demonized also in the same way that we were, who were in touch with earth spirituality, and we had ancestral veneration, and a lot of our ancestral veneration and our rituals were performed in nature because we knew the connection and the power of Mother Nature, Mother Earth. That was always feared by those colonizing us. And through the introduction of organized religion, not just organized Christianity, but also certain forms of Islam as well, that were agents of our enslavement and colonization, not all forms of it, but the particular dominant forms that were about trying to subjugate us and also demonize our own indigenous African forms of spirituality that were often deemed to be fetish, devil worship, and something evil. Yes. So our own practices, and this is not something that just happened to African people, it happened to many indigenous people. And that is because we knew, and we always worked with the mindset and the knowledge that Mother Earth is a living, sentient being. That we, as the branches, if you like, the different sections of humanity, that we come out of this one earth. But therefore, whatever we do to our earth, to our mother, actually will come back on us. And so this notion that somehow human beings are supreme and that they are supreme over all other living forms is not something that traditionally many of the indigenous peoples of the world, including African people, believed, because we knew different. Yeah, we knew that if we wanted to take something, even if we went hunting or had to cut down trees or what have you, we had to perform particular ceremonies and rituals in order to bring back balance, because what that did was cause a certain disequilibrium. Yes? So that is why essentially in our own campaigning, we wanted to create a vehicle where we could engage it through our own social movement building and, resistance politics, transformatory, prefigurative resistance politics, that we could also educate our people through popular forms and mediums about the meaning of ecocide, recognizing that the harms of the Mangamizi, of colonialism, etc., etc., didn't just impact on us as individual human beings or as collectives, communities, nationalities, ethnicities, etc., etc. The harm also impacted on our relationship with our Earth Mother, that actually provides the basis of all people's sovereignty. Yes? So any type of people's sovereignty, whether we're talking about African nations or indigenous nations, is premised, first of all, on the sovereignty of our Mother Earth. Because being indigenous really is about being connected to that part of the earth that we were born in, that our people's origin stories commence in, that we have a duty to be caretakers of and stewards of, not a duty to appropriate, to dispossess, to colonize, to terrorize, to brutalize, to pollute, and so forth, which is what happened with capitalism, industrial revolution, and industrialization of societies. That's what it brought about, because if you harm the land, if you affect the way that the move from subsistence farming, small scale farming, which was the case, move into these industrial agricultural models that are about extracting profit, extracting goods and resources, and of course you therefore need to extract labor in order to handle all of that accumulation that you seek to do, at the expense of, first of all, Mother Earth, but then those people in that part of the earth that have traditionally been caretakers of those lands, where their ancestral beginnings are, where their creation stories begin, where our umbilical cord has been cut, and therefore our people have, we have come out of that earth, but we have also died in those lands. Our blood has formed part of that earth story of creation. Therefore, we always have this connection and desire to return to or reconnect with that which is indigenous to who we are.
Thanks, Sister Esther, for making those connections. And it's why our stories are always current. Our stories is not our stories are not only stories from the past, we're very much connected um, to those harms that have been done to our Mama Earth and to us as beings, mind, body, spirit. What is preparatory justice, Sister Esther?
So I will come on to that, but just to say that the term ecocide, to go back and to say a bit more around why isn't it used, and I think maybe that's because in a lot of popular discourse today, or narrative, or talk, the term ecocide is seen as perhaps a legal term that ordinary people might feel, well, this doesn't really relate to me. Unless, of course, they're involved in environmental justice organizing, they're experiencing forms of environmental racism and dispossession, etc., where naturally these terms will have meaning to them. So ecocide has been championed by many people. In fact, one of the earliest times that it was used, that term ecocide was used, was in relation to looking at the destruction that had been caused by the deployment of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. And so ecocide, and it's been defined in different ways, but there is now a move to have a legal definition of ecocide according to international law, and it to be considered the fifth crime that is included as part of the Rome Statute, which is that statute that has the most serious crimes in international law, which include genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression, and then the term ecocide. So at the moment, the term is defined as unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment caused by those acts. That's the basic definition that was formulated by an independent expert panel for the legal definition of ecocide in 2021, very much championed by a foundation called the Stop Ecocide Foundation. And ecocide, which at its most simple, meaning ecological destruction, includes but is not limited to ocean damage, deforestation, land and water contamination, and air pollution. Now, the problem with this definition of ecocide is that there's been some critiques of it already, and the critiques are basically saying, Well, this definition of ecocide doesn't bear any resemblance to the definition of genocide, out of which it was inspired. Okay? Because in genocide, there is a recognition that there is harm done to groups, an intent to destroy a people in whole or in part. Yeah. And that's missing from this current formulation of ecocide, in that there's no sort of group destruction inherent in that terminology. And this is part of the politics of how international law that gets accepted by states, member states of the United Nations, etc., gets made. So even though there's a more sort of radical thrust that underpins it, a lot of the time, the very forces that have to implement it are the ones that might very well have an interest in making sure it doesn't come into full law. Why? Because it means that the whole way that governments earn their money through encouraging and allowing extractivist plunder of earth's and natural resources that is in a region that might be part of what they consider to be their territorial sovereignty would have to change. Yeah, capitalism would have to be transformed as we know it. And these are some kind of big term, long term, systemic structural changes that many who are elite in societies are not willing to happen to that degree. Now, there was a UK barrister, racialized as white, called Polly Higgins, and she used to refer to herself as a barrister for the earth. And she's now passed. Unfortunately, she died a couple of years ago. But Polly Higgins was very exemplary in going around the world and championing this notion of ecocide. And in the original sort of language of the Stop Ecocide Foundation that Polly Higgins co-founded with others, this notion of ecocide was also connected to, and there was a recognition that the harm of what was called cultural genocide and the destruction of groups was an integral part of ecocide, which is missing from the accepted legal definition that is now being pushed to be incorporated into the Rome Statute. So there's a huge politics there to the use of the term, and the fact that many interests that really control governments today. So even in any country where you have a political regime, oftentimes they are held captive in terms of members of that government to state and to corporate interests that really control the power makers or brokers or decision makers in any given territory. And that's what comes up when we're thinking about why isn't ecocide more recognized? Because the people who are championing it and who have been championing it are those who are saying we can't have extractivism, yeah, in the way that it's been going on. Rampant extractivism. It's harming lives, it's harming our health, not just those who are alive today, but there are intergenerational impacts of toxicity, of pollution that have gone into the earth, that have gone into the water, that have gone into our food systems that actually we might not be able to repair or recover from.
Sister Esther, I'm so thankful you took the time to expand on ecocide, because in listening to you, there are two things that stood out to me. Like, you're so on point with this conversation. The government of Belize, meaning the cabinet, the House of Representatives, the Senate, have no damn right to say that they will not ratify the Escazú agreement because Costa Rica has paused it. That's not for we business. We, the people of Belize, once more of us understand what this agreement means. In our interests as people is saying that the state needs to ratify it. And so this is exactly what you started the conversation with, because this is a serious agreement if the state ratifies it. It will definitely, and has been documented officially and unofficially, the ecological plunder, harm to the earth in Belize. One of the things that I am categorically putting forward is the Belize Blue Bond that enough Belizeans do not know about. An entity bigger than people who we elect to represent us to look after our interests as Belizean people and the territories, the earth, the air, the water, the all beings, flora and fauna. When you look at the Blue Bond, that was not what happened. Right now, recently in the past few weeks, there's an organization, these NGOs just they tired me because as what I'm reading about George Lamming, I think his name is saying that at the point where there was decolonization, either intentionally or unintentionally, a lot of political leaders in the Caribbean and people by extension did not look at what it means to separate ourselves from colonial mindsets. And so instead of having genuine popular movement, groundings with our people, what happened for development is that many governments just kind of allowed NGOs to be active in development as opposed to the people having awareness, already have it because they've lived it, inherited it, and being active participants in our future as a people and as Mama Earth. And so again, now here we have an agreement, Latin America, so-called Abayala Caribbean treaty that would bring some balance to people taking care of our own interests, that the state is saying, cabinet by default, that they're not going to ratify it after they said they were, because what that means is this will be an instrument that will hold the state accountable when it comes to any kind of negotiation, transactions, when it comes to our water, our land, our territory. Like that really came through strong.
Agricultural development projects, because a lot of this ecocide is also connected to so-called modernity and development projects, agricultural projects, large scale, that end up actually reproducing coloniality and harming the land, dispossessing communities who have traditionally lived in particular areas, and then they have to be moved because some authority now claims it owns those lands and rights to everything that comes off of those lands, mining, etc., etc., etc. And this is how the harm is continuing. And what's been happening in Europe in particular and parts of Abya Yala is and Africa in truth, there's growing environmental consciousness, if I can use that term, amongst many activists, because we're all concerned about the air that we breathe. And there is a recognition in international law that we have a right to a healthy environment. And that a lot of what's being done today under the guise of development is actually maldevelopment, as was articulated by the late Professor Walter Rodney, who spoke about the underdevelopment of Africa and how that happened, and the role of the neo-colonial elites in facilitating pillage and extractivism and plunder of regions that traditionally they should have actually been caretakers of. So this is a big, big issue that we are seeing, but because of the growing environmental consciousness, a lot more people are concerned about the future. They're concerned about the fact that our future is being stolen from us. In the region of the so-called Caribbean, we should be particularly concerned because the climate and ecological crisis is impacting many what's called small island nation states in the region, where we know if temperatures rise beyond 1.5 degrees, what that means literally destruction of many life forms that cannot be repaired. And yet they're trying to come up with all these synthetic technologies under the guise of trying to address the climate and ecological crisis that actually end up promoting different forms of extractivism in our homelands and home territories. So we have to have a global perspective, we have to have a holistic perspective that looks at not just us as the people, but what about the ecosystems through which we have to have order and we have to have harmony and balance so that we can actually eat well, we can have good air, we can have, when our children are not going to be just born with all kinds of toxins and kind of contaminants in their bloodstreams that is going to end up then making them more susceptible to getting particular cancers disproportionately and other illnesses going forward. So it's a huge, huge impact. And it's not just about, as I said, the primacy of us as human beings. There's also a recognition that all living forms, life forms, so-called nature, the animal kingdom, plant kingdom, that they are also our relations. And therefore, when you recognize an ecosystem of life and that web of life, you should care when a particular like bees that might become extinct, for instance, what that will mean for the rest of us in humanity. You begin to see your connections to other species that you were perhaps miseducated to believe do not matter and are not as important as us as human beings.
I'm reading, Sister Esther. We have another 3 minutes. Thank you so much for I know it takes a lot of time, effort, energy. It's decades that you've been doing this work. And to recognize that our African ancestors have been doing African reparation work for decades. What it has become more popular recently, but this is work that our African ancestors have been doing from the bottom up for decades. In these last 2 minutes before the segment ends, please expand some more on what genocide is, because similarly to ecocide, you don't hear the terminology genocide being used when we're having African, and we often don't have African reparations conversation. I keep saying, because I learned from you, the CARICOM 10-point, CARICOM is an economic block. The CARICOM 10-point is not an African reparations mindset. So can you share what genocide is, Sister Esther?
Sure. I mean, genocide, genocide, the killing of a group. In essence, the killing or destruction of a group. And it was a term that was coined by somebody called Dr. Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jewish jurist. And he was very interested in examining how do you destroy groups? Not because he was fanatical or something, but obviously being from a people who had experienced a form of genocide, he wanted to, he was interested in theorizing that and ensuring that this didn't happen again, and sought in the sort of newly found emerging United Nations, sought to ensure that there were processes of accountability, such as the Genocide Convention of 1948. Now, with the Genocide Convention, it talks about genocide as being an intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. And it goes into different ways in which you can destroy that group. So killing members of the group, forcibly removing children of the group and placing them with another, imposing conditions of life intended to prevent births within the group, and there are one or two other manifestations. Now, one of the things that Raphael Lemkin, so we have the Genocide Convention of 1948, a kind of international law formulation, but all of Raphael's thinking didn't make it into that Genocide Convention, which is still quite narrow, and it's quite difficult for it to be recognized that a group in the international arena and international courts, that a people have experienced a genocide. But what his own studies demonstrate is that the way that you destroy a group is through destroying their culture. Yeah, destroying the essential foundations of life, the institutions that our people have, their institutions of education, economic institutions, their political and governance institutions. And so he also argues that part of genocide is about imposing the dominant way of the oppressor on a group. Yeah. So first of all, you destroy the group's ways, and then you impose the colonizer's way on that group. And that is really something that has happened to us. So one of the key mechanisms through which genocide happens is through culture. Yeah, because when you obliterate the symbols, the institutions of a group's culture, of a group's memory, their history, their story, yeah, their ways, their value system, how they make sense of the world, you might have the people physically walking around, but almost like zombies. Yeah, where our memory of who we were has been obliterated or has been silenced, subjugated, and people live in fear of actually exercising that personality because they have learned that you get penalized when you stand out, when your hair is natural, when you're speaking up for African spirituality, when you're defending those who in their story might have been classified as terrorists rather than being freedom fighters and emancipators and liberators. And that is still the case in many Caribbean countries, where many of those who are engaged in enslavement revolts and anti-colonial revolts literally on the official record are criminalized. And there hasn't been a posthumous glorification of those people who we now know and can celebrate as emancipators.
Thank you, Sister Esther Stanford Jose. We'll take a second break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
How can we support the emotional well-being of older adults during COVID-19? During the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly while in quarantine, individuals, including older adults, may become more anxious, angry, stressed, agitated, or withdrawn, especially those who need healthcare assistance or have cognitive decline or dementia. Here are 4 strategies that can help you in supporting an older adult during this difficult time. 1. Communicate information and listen. Present with accurate, simple, and accessible information and facts about the COVID-19 outbreak, its progression, treatment, and effective strategies to prevent infection. Listen patiently to their needs and concerns. For older people with mild cognitive impairment or early stages of dementia, inform them of what is happening within their capacity and provide support to ease their anxiety and stress. 2. Promote positive mental and emotional health. Provide access to available mental health and psychosocial support services, also known as MHPSS services, for older adults and communicate when and how they can access them. Help older people keep regular routines and schedules as much as possible. You can also help them create new ones, including regular exercising, cleaning, daily chores, singing, painting, or other activities. Facilitate regular communication between older adults and their friends and families. 3. Help with medical needs. Make sure that older adults have at least up to 1 month of all the regular medicines that they may require. Explain how to use protective devices in a clear, concise way. Always be respectful and patient. 4. Assist with daily activities. Provide older people with details related to how and where they can get practical help if needed, like calling a taxi, dropping off supplies, having groceries delivered, and requesting medical care, as well as information on any locally available social support programs and services. For more information, consult the webpage of the Pan American Health Organization, www.paho.org/coronavirus.
Amandala is now online. You can now access Amandala's midweek and weekend issues online by logging on to our website at amandala.com.bz/news and joining our membership portal today. There's 5 easy steps to get unlimited access to weekly e-paper, archive publications, and a host of other exclusive contents. Number 1, go to Amandala's website. Number 2, navigate to subscribed areas. Number 3, choose a membership level. Number 4, check out using our secured portal. Number 5, log into the members only section. Telephone numbers 501-280-4703 or 202-4477. Fax us at 501-222-4702, or you could email at amandalapress@yahoo.com or amandalapress@gmail.com. Amandala, all power to the people.
benefit are we, the people, supposed to pay?
The funding you pay, no, but when you get old, you got funding for college, for your future.
If you miss some days from work, they should have compensated for that.
As an artist, I'm not really sure because I work for myself.
What is Social Security? Social Security is not a tax. Social Security is a very small investment in you, the worker. It's an investment that you can count on now or in the future. It is designed to replace part of your income from wages when you get sick, get injured on the job, have a baby on the way, become disabled, or even when you pass away. And even then, the widow and your kids, if under 16 years or under 21 years and in school, obtain survivor's pension. And after a lifetime of working, you can rest assured you will have a monthly retirement income. Social Security, safeguarding you, your family, your future.
Because this a fi we with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This a fi we with a fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. This time me name is Pupa. Belize we come from the Belize City area. 110% Belize and proud of it, sir. Don't tell me about maritime area. Long time ago agreement by the slave master. Talking about the head on the Belize and the
The final segment, Sunday Review, where we make sense of the news. This morning we have our sister, Esther Stanford Jose, reparationist, scholar activist, a consult from London in the UK, Caribbean heritage, African-centered sister. We're having a conversation about African reparations, ecocide in particular. And so in this final segment, and Sister Esther has done, as she's always done, because she spent majority of her lifetime committed. And there's a difference between, I know what sidetrack Sister Esther, I want to be very clear. There's a difference between someone who may go to school and who looks like us actually, and has decided that because I have some letters behind my name and I'm identifiably African, that I can speak for African people, African descendants racialized as Black. I burn that out. I rate people who have a track record of speaking in defense of African descendants racialized as Black people, and over the years have developed a currency of integrity. And will that person choose to stay within your communities and collect our stories and defend us at their own help interest sometimes, and choose to get additional training, knowledge, because that's what they live every day. I rate those people. So scholar activists carry more credits for me than someone who's just a scholar. That's just my preference of people I choose to work with. And so I'm saying that to say that is very important. Like, who are the people that we recognize as our leaders, who speak in our substantive leaders, not that they just look Black and they say they represent Black people, but genuinely at their own risk represent our interests and have been doing so for decades. And they're people who they took the baton from. So that's one of the things that Sister Esther is focusing on academically, to say in Europe, who have been the people for generations who have represented African people's interests, genuine interests. And then Sister Esther to talk about what reparatory justice is in contemporary times, and do a Sankofa, you're going back and come back. Teacher, sister, teach me.
So in the UK in particular, the struggle for African reparations goes back to the mid-1700s. This is not a new conversation. This is an old conversation. And since that time, in particular in the 1780s, there was an organization called the Sons of Africa, and there was a famous member of that organization called Otoba Kugwano, and he wrote a political treatise it was called actually The Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Human Species, talking about African enslavement. And in this book, in the 1791 version of the book. It had first been published around, I think, 1787 or so. He argued that African people had a right to not only defend themselves in terms of the oppression that they were facing, so they had a right to resistance, they had a right to freedom struggle, liberation struggle, but he also argued that African people should receive restitution for the injuries that they had faced. And the term restitution is actually one of the terms or the aspects of holistic reparations under international law. So there is something called the Basic Principles and Guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law, that was developed in 2005 as a result of centuries of advocacy and jurisprudence, which is the science and philosophy of law, on reparations. So this framework identifies 5 key aspects of reparations. The first being what's known as stopping the harm. So when we in the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, we're saying stop the Maangamizi, which isn't just chattel slavery. It's colonialism, it is settler colonialism, it is neo-colonialism today, and imperialism. We also then have to have what's known as assurances and guarantees of non-repetition, which means when you stop a harm, you don't then reintroduce it under the guise of something else the next day. It has to end for all time. And one of the most common legacies of the Maangamizi is racism. Anti-black racism, but the specific form that people of African descent face, which is called Afrophobia, which is anti-African prejudice and discrimination. So restitution is another principle of reparations under international law, which really speaks to the fact that when you enslave a people, colonize, terrorize, you perpetrate crimes against humanity, you essentially strip them of their power, of their agency, you strip them of their connection and rights to belong, and therefore become stewards of a particular landmass, and therefore have a responsibility to ensure that resources that come out of that landmass are utilized effectively. And so restitution is about putting a people or a group back in the position they would have been in, but for the Maangamizi in all its phases and all its manifestations. So imagine, where would we have been if we were not enslaved, if we were not colonized, if we were not denied access to intergenerational wealth? We wouldn't have this huge global wealth divide, not only in terms of wealth, but access to resources, access to even land. I mean, there's a book, a very famous book called Who Owns the World? And it was written by a Scottish author called Kevin Cahill. And one of the statistics he gave in that book is that Queen Elizabeth II, she was alive at the time of him writing the book, is the world's largest landowner, who has legal title to 1/6 of planet Earth. And one of the other statistics that he, or indicators of wealth and impoverishment that he raises in that book, is that the commonest characteristic between those who are wealthy and those who are not are those who have been able to acquire, use, and ownership of land, and have access to land, and therefore can control what happens to the land and all the resources that come out of that land. And that is why in 2016, there was a report called Britain's New Colonialism, produced by an NGO in the UK called War on One and others, that identified that 101 companies registered on the London Stock Exchange control over 1 trillion, this was a conservative figure, over $1 trillion, pounds, worth of Africa's key energy and mineral resources. So this is not African people in specific countries and regions, etc., etc. These are corporations that you could say are British. Let's now add up the American corporations, the German corporations, the Australian corporations, the Canadian corporations, the Chinese corporations that have their tentacles in corporations that are transnational, that are involved in extracting resources from the region. So in the Caribbean, a lot of bauxite mining and other types of mining that are going on. Deep sea water mining that is destroying again the earth systems and equilibrium. So this is what we're talking about in terms of why we need reparatory justice. And so I was talking about the UN framework and restitution as one principle. There's compensation, which everyone jumps to when they think about reparations. But in truth, compensatory measures should really be to resource a group's restitutional kind of program. How do we restore our citizenship, our lost right to belong to our homeland? So even in Belize, that's where your people have been for some time. Doesn't mean you're physically going to get up and leave Belize, but you should be able to benefit from intergenerational wealth that your lineage has been deprived of, to actually assist you and your family in going forwards. Why should the wealth that we have generated still be in the hands of enslavers and their families and elites, whether they're kind of economic elites, political elites, academic elites, etc., etc. Satisfaction, which is known as symbolic reparations, and then rehabilitation. So that's reparations under international law. This is a very conventional framework. Some people might say it's reformist to some degree, and so we couple that with the struggles for self-determination, to restore our sovereignty as African people across the world wherever we are. So really, if we're going to have true restitution, it would look something like removing those colonial borders in Africa, the colonial borders in the so-called Caribbean and Abya Yala. How did the term Belize come about? Who defines who is Belizean or any other nationality in these regions? We have had identities imposed, shaped, forced upon us that de-link us from our people's power, our people's resources, our people's intergenerational wealth, because we then become imprisoned and locked into a narrow part of Mother Earth that someone has said, this is what belongs to you. And you dare not make links with people who were also from your lineage that might have been taken to a different country in the so-called Caribbean and therefore have a different national identity today. You dare not adopt pan-Caribbeanism, pan-indigeneity, pan-Africanism as a way of actually unifying with people who, like you, have gone through similar experiences by virtue of their group identity. So you can't have true reparatory justice without restoring to us our sovereignty, African sovereignty, which again is premised on earth sovereignty. We have to restore the sovereignty of our earth mother first. And clearly, our earth mother does not have sovereignty. That is why we have doctrines of discovery, doctrines of dispossession, which have become legalized and have been utilized to deny indigenous people right to title, what's often called native title, over large parts of Mother Earth. And in those lands where we've had colonialism and settler colonialism, these are the lands that often, in terms of the elite nations, many of them emanating out of Europe, that have been globalized. This is where we're seeing the origins of this climate and ecological crisis, because of a lifestyle that is really a death style that has been imposed on the rest of humanity under the guise of so-called development, civilization, progress, advancement, etc., etc. And many of us as original peoples, indigenous people of various descriptions, ethnicities, and nationalities are rediscovering our group memory. We're rediscovering who we are, what our connection is, not only to each other, but what our connection is to the whole of Mother Earth. And many of us are saying, no, we're not going to allow you to keep on doing these things in our name. We're not going to allow you to keep on mining the bowels out of Mother Earth because it's harming our system. It's harming not only the Earth systems, which sustain all life, but it's polluting the environment, it's polluting our water, it's polluting our food, and it's having impacts on our own health as human beings, as well as the health of all other living species.
Respect, Sister Esther. Before you leave us this morning temporarily, can you give us a clear description of what the CARICOM 10-point is and what African reparation is? And why, again, before I found out about African reparations, the only knowledge I had was the CARICOM 10-point. And many of our people, that's the only knowledge they have when they hear African reparations. So the first Sunday of every month in 2022, and the same for 2023, United Black Association for Development Education Foundation, leading from the bottom up, is leading our own campaign about African reparations.
Mm-hmm.
And we hope that people will be open to listen, to overstand, not to right or wrong, which is oftentimes judgmental, but to gather the knowledge of our African ancestors, the work they've done, the work that we're now responsible to do for us and our unborn children. Are you able to do that this morning, Sister Esther?
Okay, so I have like 5 minutes. It's not enough time to really go into what is the CARICOM 10-point plan. But people can Google it. There's a 10-point action plan for reparatory justice. I think that the main thing is to identify this 10-point plan includes different stuff. It includes, tackling the public health crisis, for instance. It includes an African knowledge program. It includes indigenous development. It includes issues such as what they call debt cancellation. And the plan has been, I'm told that the plan has actually been, I'm told that the plan has been updated, although to include some aspects of some of the critiques that have been made of the plan. So people can go and look at the plan themselves. I don't want to spend the precious time I have being an advocate for the plan, because that's already very much being reported on in the region. And it's probably, if people know anything about reparations, it might just be what's coming out of CARICOM, as opposed to the other perspectives that I represent. I think it's important to talk about, in the couple of minutes I have left, the main differences. So the CARICOM 10-point plan is based on reinforcing European hegemony in the region of the Caribbean. I mean, it doesn't say that, but if you look at the foundation of the plan, it's not a plan that is linked to the radical redistribution of wealth and resources worldwide. It's not a Pan-African plan. It's a plan that is simply to address the reparatory justice concerns, if you like, as shaped by the CARICOM Reparations Commission and people like Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Professor Vereen Shepherd, and others. It's looking at those who physically live in the Caribbean, which, by the way, half of the population of the Caribbean live outside of the Caribbean and are diasporas and are not included, have not been included in shaping this plan. So it is being framed as a development plan. That's the most important thing people need to know. And in international law, there is the right to development and there is the right to reparations, a remedy and reparations, and they are not the same thing. So people have a right to development. In Belize, you have a right to development. Here, even though I'm part of the African Caribbean diaspora communities, I have a right to development. My people have a right to development. But when you take a remedy of reparations, which are as a result of a specific violations that have happened to a specific people, and then you conflate that with development, which is something that happens across all peoples in a region, in a country, for instance. So if you are a European settler, you have that same right to development. If you're an African heritage community, you have that right to development. If you are indigenous, you have that same right to development. So what you then take are specific injustices and you seek to redress those by saying, well, the state is going to administer reparations. And naturally, as a state is not going to say, well, we're only going to do this for some of you and we're not going to pay attention to the other citizens in the country. They're going to say, well, we have to do something that everybody can benefit from. And in doing that, you take an approach of literally one size fits all, that is not tailored to address the specific injustices and maladies and maldevelopment that have been experienced by specific groups. And so primarily, I would say in the Caribbean, there isn't, as is the case in South Abya in South America, so-called, a recognition of plurinationalism, which is the modern day Caribbean nation states should actually recognize indigenous sovereignty, African sovereignty. There should be forms of maybe federalism around so that those people can actually be restored to their own group power. That is what's happening in Ecuador, in Peru, in Bolivia, where their constitutions are based on plurinationalism. In the Africa and in Caribbean, we do not have plurinational nation states. There are attempts like Ethiopia in terms of federalism, but there's been some tensions in that region, if anyone knows about the politics of that region. So we have a model of statehood that is still premised on actually Europe. It was designed for Europeans and it was exported during colonization. That cannot be the model that we use to actually restore ourselves, restitute ourselves to ourselves, restore our African heritage community resources, restituted resources that we can use for our Pan-African development planning, reparations planning that should be taking place in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Europe, in the rest of the so-called Americas, wherever our people are. So by nature of the fact that they are still very much about a regional plan that is preserving the borders of European colonization, especially those that were shaped after 1884, 1885, and the impact that that then had on the region, then this is not a true restitutional measure, even by the terms of restitution. How can we as African people gain sovereignty in a nation state like Belize or any other in the so-called Caribbean when there isn't a recognition of our own governance systems? There isn't a recognition of Ma'at, of Ubuntu in the way in which our societies are run, that actually the political frameworks are still those based on what has come out of global Europe that we are reinforcing and we have internalized under the guise of rule of law and democracy. But actually there are many non-rule of law societies that predated European colonialism that have been more fair to our peoples. So if we don't know what we lost, if we don't know what was taken from us, if we don't know our own history of political state and formation, then how can we restore it wherever we are when we still have an enslaved person's idea and lens of freedom, which is what Bell Hooks argued, that to the enslaved, they still have a slave master's view of freedom, okay? And therefore the slave master's way of life is what we aspire to emulate as an indication that we too are human beings, that we too are developed, that we too are civilized. But that is premised on the genocide, the ethnocide, and the epistemicide, which is the destruction of our African people's knowledge systems that we need to regenerate and recultivate in order to regain our power. And our disempowerment is what is keeping us subjugated, because they know that we do not know our true story. And if we do not know our true story, what are we going to rebuild with? We know what has been done to us, but what then are we going to form those freedom visions in terms of actualizing that through prefiguring a new world, literally bringing that new world into being through our own actions?
You're good, sis. You're great. You're awesome. We really value this relationship that we have with you and our sisters and brothers in the UK, and there are other people who are doing such work. UF is being very intentional in reaching out to such leaders within the region in this Gregorian calendar year. You will be able to listen to this program. It'll rebroadcast this afternoon at 5:30 in Krem Television. You can now go this afternoon to Krem Television YouTube channel, and you will see Krem Sunday Review for 2023 in that space. You could listen to it at your convenience. We encourage Belizeans to take ownership. You, as a Belizean person, nationality, of African ancestry, racialized as Black, to do the work, to learn about yourself so that we can help each other globally. Sister Esther Stanford Jose, scholar activist, reparationist, African reparationist in particular, Jewish consult. Thank you so much again, sis, for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to share, to listen, to learn, to teach. We keep you in high vibration that you may maintain well-being, mind, body, spirit, you and your family, and all others who are engaged in this work collectively and globally. And we want to thank our security guard. I don't know who's the security guard today. It's usually one of three brothers. I don't know if it's Solomon. I don't know if it's Shane. I don't know who the security guard is today at Zinc Fence. And we want to say thank you. Definitely, we also want to thank Sister Jada Anderson, Master Control Operator in Krem Television Studio at 3304 Amandela Drive in Southside Belize City, and our engineer in Krem Radio on the second flat of Kremandela's building. I believe it'll be Larry G. Thank you so much, Larry. I know we went over a little bit this morning. It's Harry. It's Harry every Sunday, Harry. What the Harry last name? I think it started on B. I don't remember. Anyways, Harry, you know I have good intentions for you, brother. I want to thank those Belizeans who consistently support Zinc Fence products in every way, by listening, by sharing, by calling in, by posting comments, by having additional reasoning wherever you are, at home or in the diaspora. We want to say to African people, racialized as Black people globally, keep heart. One, we're still here. We are still here. That's winning. With all that have been done, intentionally, we are still here. We're still resisting, just like our enslaved African ancestors resisted from the tiny kidnapping. We're still here. Let me say specifically to the Cabinet of Belize, August 1st, 2023 is a public and bank holiday that was initiated under this administration. African Emancipation Day is August 1st, not July 31st, as you have independently decided, because the 1st is a Tuesday. We understand that we are not free. The emancipation of our people was a legal act to liberate African people from physical enslavement. But on that day, globally, and if you could just add a 2 cents to the Sister Esther, while on that day, African descendants, racialized as Black people globally, in maybe in English-speaking territories, on that day, we're holding each other in vibration. It means something that August 1st our vibrations are connected. So if you can just quickly say, if you would like, Sister Esther, I'm not trying to draw into Belize politics, that the cabinet has chosen that July 31st is when the public and bank holiday will be, and not Tuesday, August 1st, 2023.
Look, the fact of the matter is, the 1st of August, which is championed as Emancipation Day, it really didn't emancipate us. So that's also a myth in the history. And what that did, it reinforced African subjugation, because there was still, we had to still work and not be paid for it. So the period of apprenticeship that took place after the passing of the 1833 Abolition of Slavery Act. Yeah. Now there's that. Now it was also that act which went on to introduce other acts, such as the 1837 Slave Compensation Act, where our enslavers were compensated for, quote unquote, their loss of property in us. So Emancipation Day, from a historical reading, if you read the works of Professor Chris Van Japra in particular, he argues that inherent within Emancipation Day was also a crime against humanity, because of the way in which it reinforced African subjugation. But the 1st of August, which we refer to as 1st of Messiah, has still been utilized as a rallying point to focus on issues of emancipation, not just supposedly in the past, but more importantly, the continued struggle for emancipation. And so it is a symbolic rallying point where we can conscientize and mobilize our people in defense of and recognition of the different stages in our people's struggle. That's what I would say about Emancipation Day. So there's a politics to it. But more importantly, the government of Belize should not be arrogating to itself the decision-making power to suddenly just decide that the 1st of August is not relevant and they're going to make this Emancipation Day on the 31st of July. That is totally wrong. And it is it is exactly one of the examples of what I've been referring to, where we lack power. We lack African power, even where we might be the majority populations in some of these countries. Because those who are running these administrations really with the relics of white power that is then deployed against our own people. Yes? And so a government that itself seeks to champion a reparatory justice approach must itself follow international law. And that is, you must recognize the rights of affected communities, which is the descendants of the enslaved and the colonized, to have self-determination, to exercise it in all areas and aspects of our people activity, including what days the state should recognize as being symbolic in our people's story.
Thank you, Sister Esther. I will be using what you just shared in different variations as UEF continue to hold the government of Belize accountable as it relates to August 1st, 2023 being recognized as African Emancipation Day. Have a peaceful day. Solidarity forever.
Blessings. Thank you.
Massacre, la mismo presidente quiere we hago pica. This happy week, we da fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Oh no, this happy week, we da fear. Nobody give it to no Guatemala. Belize if you need me, if you need a soldier, just send to the